The air is thick with sulfur. The sky hasn't been blue in years, maybe decades. It's a perpetual dirty orange, like the colour of rust mixed with ash. You're standing on what used to be a coastline, but the ocean is 3 miles further out now than it was when your grandparents were alive. And it's not that the land rose up. The water is just gone, evaporated, locked away in the atmosphere as choking humidity that makes every breath feel like drowning. Around you, the ground is littered with bodies. Fish that washed ashore and never made it back to water. Reptiles that crawled out of the forest looking for food that doesn't exist anymore. Plants that grew for millions of years, now just blackened stems poking through cracked earth. This isn't a war zone. There are no bombs, no fires, no armies. This is just Earth, 252 million years ago. And life itself is ending. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's literally why I make it. So subscribe maybe, and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check the comments and it's like Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, all at once. There's something comforting about knowing we're all scattered across the globe, falling asleep to the same story of ancient catastrophe. Now, you've probably heard of mass extinctions before. The asteroid that killed the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. That one's famous. It's in movies, documentaries, children's books. A giant rock from space slams into Earth, throws up a dust cloud that blocks out the sun, and boom, 75% of species gone. Terrible, catastrophic, world-ending. Except it wasn't world-ending. Not even close. Because 186 million years earlier, something far worse happened. Something so devastating that it makes the dinosaur extinction look like a bad weekend. Scientists call it the Permian-Triassic extinction event. But they have another name for it too, one that's more honest, more chilling. The Great Dying. Here are the numbers, and just try to wrap your head around them. 96% of all marine species wiped out. Not 96% of individuals, 96% of entire species. Trilobites, which had survived for 270 million years, everything Earth could throw at them, gone. Tabulate corals that built the reefs of the Permian seas, extinct. Blastoids, crinoids, eurypterids, names you've never heard because they don't exist anymore, because they all died in the same geological instant. On land, it was 70% of vertebrate species, the dominant reptiles that had ruled the continents for tens of millions of years, mostly dead. The insects that filled the air, nearly extinct. And here's the really terrifying part. Insects almost never go extinct. They're too adaptable, too numerous, too good at surviving. But during the Great Dying, 8 out of 10 insect orders vanished. That's the only mass extinction in Earth's history that significantly affected insects. Think about that. Something happened that was so catastrophic, so all-encompassing, that even creatures that can survive nuclear radiation, that can live in boiling water, that can go without food for months, even they couldn't make it. In total, roughly 90% of all species on Earth disappeared. Not over millions of years, not gradually. The killing pulse happened in maybe 60,000 years, possibly much faster. In geological terms, that's a finger snap. You know that feeling when you read about a disaster and think, how did anyone survive that? That's the Great Dying. Except magnified across an entire planet, across every ocean, every continent, every ecosystem from the poles to the equator. Nowhere was safe. Nothing was spared. So here's the question that scientists have been obsessing over for decades. What could do this? What force of nature is powerful enough to kill 90% of all species simultaneously across the entire planet? It wasn't an asteroid. We've looked. There's no impact crater from the right time period, no iridium layer like the one that marks the dinosaur extinction. It wasn't a nearby supernova bathing Earth in radiation. It wasn't an ice age. If anything, the world got hotter, much hotter. The answer, when scientists finally pieced it together, turned out to be more terrifying than any single catastrophe. Because it wasn't one thing, it was everything. A cascade of disasters, each one triggering the next, like dominoes falling in slow motion for 1,000,000 years. Volcanic eruptions that wouldn't stop, climate change that turned the world into an oven, oceans that ran out of oxygen and filled with poison instead, and feedback loops. Oh, the feedback loops, where each disaster made the others worse until the entire planetary system was locked in a death spiral. This is the story of how Earth almost died, how life itself came within a razor's edge of complete annihilation, and somehow, impossibly, how a few desperate survivors held on long enough for the world to start over. The catastrophe began in what is now Siberia, with the largest volcanic eruption in the last 500 million years. Picture the Earth 252 million years ago. If you could see it from space, you'd notice something immediately wrong. Well, not wrong exactly, but profoundly different from anything you've ever seen. All the continents are fused together into one massive supercontinent, Pangaea, the ultimate landmass. From pole to pole, from one edge of the world to the other, it's all connected. No Atlantic Ocean, no Pacific in the modern sense, just Pangaea surrounded by a single world ocean called Panthalassa. Now, you might think having all the land connected would make life easier. More territory to spread across, no ocean barriers preventing species from reaching new habitats. But here's the thing about supercontinents. They create environmental conditions that are absolutely brutal for most forms of life. The interior of Pangaea was a desert. Not just any desert, but one of the largest, driest, most hostile environments in Earth's history. Thousands of miles from any ocean, with mountain ranges blocking moisture-laden winds from the coasts. The centre of Pangaea received almost no rainfall. We're talking about regions where it might not rain for decades at a time, where temperatures could swing from freezing at night to scorching during the day, where the only water came from occasional flash floods that would turn dry valleys into raging torrents for a few hours before evaporating back into the merciless air. The coastal regions were better. River valleys cutting through the interior brought water from distant highlands. Seasonal monsoons drenched some areas with enough rain to support forests and swamps. But even these habitable zones were separated by vast expanses of hostile terrain. A species living on the eastern coast of Pangaea might be thousands of miles from its nearest relatives on the western coast, with an entire continent of desert and badlands between them. This created something biologists call extreme habitat fragmentation. Life couldn't spread evenly across the supercontinent. Instead, it clustered in scattered refuges, pockets of habitability surrounded by regions that were essentially dead zones. This fragmentation would prove crucial during the catastrophe to come, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because despite these harsh conditions, life in the late Permian was thriving. More than thriving, actually. It had reached levels of diversity and complexity that wouldn't be matched again for millions of years. The dominant land animals weren't dinosaurs. Those wouldn't evolve for another 20 million years. Instead, the late Permian belonged to the synapsids, our distant ancestors, though you wouldn't recognize them as relatives. These were creatures that had been evolving separately from the reptilian line for over 100 million years, developing their own bizarre adaptations to terrestrial life. At the top of the food chain were the Gorgonopsians. Imagine a creature that looks like someone combined a saber-toothed cat with a Komodo dragon and then decided to make it even more terrifying. Gorgonopsians were the apex predators of their time, ranging from dog-sized hunters to massive 10-foot-long killing machines. They had enormous canine teeth, some species sporting fangs as long as your hand. These weren't for show. They were precision instruments for severing arteries and crushing vertebrae. But here's what's really fascinating about Gorgonopsians. They weren't cold-blooded like modern reptiles. Fossil evidence suggests they had elevated metabolic rates, possibly even the beginnings of warm-bloodedness. Their bone structure shows rapid growth patterns similar to modern mammals. Some species probably had whiskers, suggesting they had the kind of sensitive facial nerves that only appear in animals with sophisticated sensory processing. They were also probably covered in primitive hair-like structures. Not fur exactly, but something between scales and true hair. These proto-hairs would have helped regulate body temperature in Pangaea's extreme climate, keeping them warm during cold nights and insulating against heat during the day. And they were everywhere. Gorgonopsian fossils show up in what's now South Africa, Russia, Tanzania. Evidence that these predators had spread across vast regions of Pangaea, adapting to different environments while maintaining their position at the top of the food chain. But the Gorgonopsians weren't alone. The late Permian had an entire ecosystem of synapsid megafauna. Dinocephalians, whose name literally means terrible head, were massive herbivores and omnivores with incredibly thick skulls. Some species had skulls over a foot thick, reinforced with extra bone and air spaces. They were living battering rams, probably using those massive heads in combat for territory and mates. Imagine the sound of two male dinocephalians colliding head-on during mating season. The crack of bone on bone echoing across Permian valleys like thunder. Then there were the dicynodonts, the most successful herbivores in late Permian ecosystems. These were weird-looking creatures with turtle-like beaks and sometimes prominent tusks. They range from rat-sized burrowers to multi-ton mega-herbivores that dominated the landscape like the buffalo of their day. Some species developed specialized digging adaptations, creating elaborate burrow systems that might have sheltered dozens of individuals. Others formed massive herds that migrated across Pangaea, following seasonal rains and fresh vegetation. The diversity was staggering. Every ecological niche you can imagine was occupied by some bizarre synapsid species. Small insectivores that hunted in the leaf litter, mid-sized omnivores that could exploit both plant and animal food sources, specialized diggers, climbers, swimmers, each species the product of millions of years of evolution, perfectly adapted to its particular role in the ecosystem. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. These creatures had complex social behaviors. Fossil trackways show evidence of dicynodonts moving in organized herds. Burrow systems suggest cooperative behavior, possibly even extended family groups living together. Some predator species might have hunted in packs, coordinating their attacks on larger prey. They were also probably quite intelligent by the standards of the time. Brain case studies suggest some synapsids had relatively large brains for their body size, with well-developed sensory processing centers. They could learn, adapt, recognize individuals, possibly even engage in basic problem-solving. This wasn't just a world of animals. This was a world of societies, of ecological relationships built over millions of years of co-evolution. Predators that had learned exactly how to hunt specific prey species, herbivores that had developed defenses perfectly calibrated to their predators' hunting techniques, scavengers, parasites, symbiotic relationships, all the complexity of a modern ecosystem, just with completely different players. The forests of the late Permian were unlike anything you'd see today. They'd finally recovered from the Carboniferous period, when so much plant material had been buried to form coal deposits that forests had nearly disappeared. Now, 50 million years later, they were back with a vengeance. But these weren't forests of flowering plants or even conifers in the modern sense. The dominant trees were glossopterids, seed ferns with distinctive tongue-shaped leaves that could grow to enormous sizes. These trees had developed sophisticated adaptations to Pangaea's harsh interior climate, deep root systems that could tap underground water sources, thick, waxy leaves that minimized water loss. Some species were deciduous, dropping their leaves during the dry season to conserve resources. Understory plants included primitive conifers, cycads, and tree ferns. The forest floor was covered with primitive mosses and lichens, and living among all this vegetation was an entire world of invertebrates. Insects had been evolving for over 150 million years by this point. They'd developed an incredible array of forms: primitive beetles, early relatives of modern dragonflies with wingspans over a foot across, cockroaches that had already perfected their design and would survive virtually unchanged to the present day. These insects weren't just passengers in the ecosystem. They were crucial players, pollinators transferring pollen between plants, decomposers breaking down dead vegetation and returning nutrients to the soil, prey species supporting entire food webs of insectivorous animals. The forests couldn't function without them, and they couldn't function without the forests. It was an intricate dance of mutual dependency that had been choreographed over millions of years. The oceans of the late Permian were even more diverse than the land. After hundreds of millions of years of evolution, marine life had developed into ecosystems of staggering complexity. Trilobites, those iconic arthropods that had dominated Paleozoic seas, were still abundant. Thousands of species occupied every conceivable marine habitat, from shallow coastal waters to the deep ocean floor. Some species were tiny, barely larger than a grain of sand. Others had grown to over 2 feet long, armoured predators of the sea floor. They'd been evolving for 270 million years by this point, adapting to every environmental shift, every mass extinction, every challenge the Earth could throw at them. They seemed invincible, permanent fixtures of Earth's oceans. But they weren't alone. Brachiopods, sometimes called lampshells, formed vast beds on the ocean floor. These weren't modern clams or mussels. Those wouldn't become dominant until after the Permian. Brachiopods had their own unique body plan, with 2 shells that opened vertically rather than horizontally. They filtered food from the water, creating massive reef-like structures in shallow seas. And speaking of reefs, the late Permian had developed some of the most extensive reef systems in Earth's history. Not coral reefs exactly, though early coral relatives were present. These reefs were built by an incredible variety of organisms: sponges, bryozoans, algae, and creatures that have no modern equivalents. Some reefs extended for hundreds of miles along ancient coastlines, creating barriers between open ocean and shallow lagoons. These reef systems supported astounding biodiversity. Thousands of species of fish, most of them completely unlike modern fish. Early sharks that had been perfecting their design for 200 million years. Armoured fish covered in bony plates. Strange, jawless fish that filtered food from the water, and swimming among them, massive marine reptiles that had recently returned to the ocean from the land. Early relatives of the ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs that would later dominate Mesozoic seas. The ocean floor was patrolled by massive sea scorpions, arthropods that could reach 6 feet in length. Some species were ambush predators, hiding in seafloor sediments waiting for prey. Others were active hunters, pursuing fish and smaller arthropods through shallow waters. And everywhere, in every habitat from the shallowest tide pools to the deepest ocean trenches, life had filled every available niche. The late Permian oceans weren't just diverse, they were saturated with life. Every cubic metre of water contained multiple species competing, cooperating, eating and being eaten in an endless cycle that had continued for hundreds of millions of years. The delicate balance was perfect, too perfect maybe. These ecosystems had become so specialized, so interconnected, that every species depended on dozens of others. Remove one piece and the whole structure might weaken. Remove several and it could collapse entirely. But no one could have predicted what was coming. How could they? Life had survived asteroid impacts, ice ages, massive volcanic eruptions, and multiple extinction events over the past 500 million years. Every time the biosphere had recovered, often emerging more diverse than before. There was no reason to think this time would be any different. The creatures of the late Permian went about their lives completely unaware that they were living in the final moments of their world. Gorgonopsians hunted in Permian forests. Dicynodonts grazed in vast herds across ancient floodplains. Trilobites scuttled across ocean floors they'd inhabited since the dawn of complex life. And deep beneath what's now Siberia, pressure was building. Magma rising from the mantle, forcing its way toward the surface, preparing to unleash an eruption that would make every volcanic disaster in recorded human history look like a firecracker. The stage was set, the players were in position, and the curtain was about to rise on the greatest catastrophe Earth has ever known. Now we need to talk about what caused all of this. What could possibly destroy 90% of all species on Earth? What force could be so devastating that it made the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs look like a minor inconvenience? The answer lies in Siberia. But we're not talking about a single volcanic eruption, not a Krakatoa or a Mount St. Helens. We're talking about something so massive, so prolonged, so utterly catastrophic that it barely fits into human comprehension. Picture this. 252 million years ago, deep beneath what is now Siberia, something stirred. A plume of superheated rock, hundreds of miles wide, was rising from the boundary between Earth's core and mantle. This wasn't normal volcanic activity. This was a mantle plume, a massive upwelling of material from nearly 2,000 miles below the surface, carrying heat and pressure that had been building for millions of years. When it finally reached the crust, it didn't just create a volcano, it cracked the Earth's surface open like an eggshell. What happened next was the largest volcanic event in the last 500 million years. Magma began pouring out of fissures in the ground. Not explosively shooting into the air, though, there was plenty of that too, but flowing out in massive floods of molten rock. These are called flood basalt eruptions, and they're different from anything most people imagine when they think of volcanoes. Forget the cone-shaped mountains you see in textbooks. This was different. This was magma erupting from cracks in the ground that stretched for hundreds of miles. Lava flows moving across the landscape like slow-motion tsunamis, each flow thick enough to bury a skyscraper, each one covering thousands of square miles before it cooled and solidified, and it didn't stop. It kept going for 1 million years, maybe 2 million. The exact duration is hard to pin down because geological dating at this scale has limits, but the evidence is clear. This wasn't a brief catastrophe. This was a prolonged apocalypse that lasted longer than modern humans have existed as a species. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. The Siberian Traps, as geologists call this volcanic province, eventually covered an area larger than Europe. Some estimates put it at over 2 million square miles. That's bigger than the entire continental United States east of the Mississippi River. All of it buried under layer upon layer of volcanic rock, some layers over 1 mile thick. But here's what makes it even worse. The eruptions didn't happen all at once. They came in pulses, massive bursts of volcanic activity that would last for thousands of years, followed by quieter periods, then another pulse even bigger than the last. Each pulse would flood the landscape with fresh lava, release enormous quantities of volcanic gases, and trigger its own cascade of environmental catastrophes. The the first pulse probably came as a shock to any life in the region. One day you're a perfectly content Permian reptile going about your business. The next day, the ground is shaking, fissures are opening in the earth, and molten rock is pouring across the landscape at temperatures hot enough to vaporize anything in its path. Animals that couldn't move fast enough were incinerated. Forests were consumed in firestorms. Rivers boiled away. But the lava itself was actually the least of the world's problems. What really mattered was the gas. Every volcanic eruption releases gases, mostly water vapor and carbon dioxide, but also sulfur dioxide, hydrogen sulfide, chlorine, fluorine, and dozens of other compounds. The Siberian Traps eruptions release these gases on a scale that defies imagination. We're talking about trillions of tons of carbon dioxide pumped into the atmosphere over the course of the eruptions, enough to raise atmospheric CO2 levels to more than 2,000 parts per million, possibly as high as 4,000. For comparison, pre-industrial levels were around 280 parts per million. Today we're at about 420 and already seeing dramatic climate effects. But carbon dioxide was just the beginning. The eruptions also released massive quantities of sulfur dioxide. When sulfur dioxide reaches the stratosphere, it reacts with water vapor to form sulfuric acid aerosols. These tiny droplets reflect sunlight back into space, cooling the planet. A single large volcanic eruption can cool global temperatures by a degree or two for a few years. The Siberian Traps were doing this continuously, in pulses, for hundreds of thousands of years. This created an immediate volcanic winter. Sunlight dimmed, blocked by the sulfuric acid haze in the stratosphere. Global temperatures plummeted, possibly by 10 or 15 degrees Celsius during the most intense eruption pulses. Photosynthesis slowed as plants struggled with reduced light. Growing seasons shortened. Food chains began collapsing from the bottom up. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. Sulfuric acid aerosols only stay in the stratosphere for a few years. Eventually they fall back to Earth as acid rain. The carbon dioxide, though, that stays in the atmosphere for thousands of years. So, what happened was this. Each major eruption pulse would create a volcanic winter, lasting a few years to a few decades. The world would cool dramatically. Then, as the aerosols fell out, the accumulated carbon dioxide would kick in. The volcanic winter would end, and it would be replaced by extreme greenhouse warming. The planet didn't just experience one climate catastrophe, it experienced dozens, maybe hundreds of them. Rapid cooling followed by rapid warming over and over for 1 million years. Ecosystems couldn't adapt because the conditions kept changing faster than evolution could respond. Species that adapted to cold conditions would be killed off when warming returned. Species that survived the warming would be devastated by the next cooling pulse. But we're still not done with the gases, because the Siberian Traps eruptions had another trick up their sleeve, something that made them uniquely devastating. The magma was rising through one of the world's largest coal and petroleum deposits. Think about that for a second. The Siberian region in the Permian was covered with thick layers of coal, formed from ancient forests that had grown there millions of years earlier. There were also extensive petroleum and natural gas deposits. When the superheated magma reached these deposits, it didn't just flow over them, it ignited them. Underground coal seams caught fire and burned for thousands of years. Oil and gas deposits erupted in massive explosions that sent additional greenhouse gases rocketing into the atmosphere. The magma literally cooked the organic carbon in these deposits, converting it directly into carbon dioxide and methane. This wasn't just volcanic outgassing anymore. This was burning the Earth's ancient carbon reserves, dumping hundreds of millions of years' worth of stored carbon back into the atmosphere in geological instants. The methane was particularly devastating. Methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, about 80 times more effective at trapping heat over a 20-year period. The burning coal and petroleum deposits released so much methane that atmospheric concentrations skyrocketed. This added another layer of greenhouse warming on top of everything else. The temperature swings became even more extreme. The climate system was being hammered from multiple directions at once. And then there were the halogens, chlorine and fluorine gases released in enormous quantities by the eruptions. These gases don't get as much attention as carbon dioxide or sulfur dioxide, but they were equally devastating in their own way. When chlorine and fluorine reach the upper atmosphere, they destroy ozone. The Permian didn't have an ozone layer as thick as ours, but it had one, and the Siberian Traps eruption shredded it. Without an ozone layer, harmful ultraviolet radiation from the sun reaches the Earth's surface unfiltered. UV radiation damages DNA, kills plankton, causes mutations in plants and animals, and generally makes life on land and in shallow oceans much more difficult. Species that might have survived the climate chaos and the acid rain now had to deal with radiation levels that would have given them the equivalent of permanent sunburn. The volcanic ash was another problem. Each eruption pulse sent billions of tons of ash into the atmosphere. Unlike the sulfuric acid aerosols that stayed suspended for years, most ash falls out relatively quickly, usually within weeks or months. But there was so much of it. Ash layers from the Siberian Traps eruptions can be found in the geological record across much of the northern hemisphere, some layers several feet thick. Imagine what this meant for life on the ground. Ash falls would have buried vegetation, contaminated water sources, caused respiratory problems in animals, and made food scarce. Each major eruption pulse would have created temporary ashlands, regions where nothing could survive until the ash either washed away or was covered by new soil. For animals trying to migrate away from the devastation, there was nowhere to go. The volcanic province was so enormous that escape routes were limited, and the ash was spreading across the entire planet. The lava flows themselves were transforming the landscape in ways that would affect the climate for millions of years. Basalt lava, the kind produced by flood basalt eruptions, is dark, almost black when fresh. An area the size of Europe, covered in dark rock, absorbs far more solar radiation than whatever vegetation or lighter-coloured rock had been there before. This changed the regional climate, possibly even the global climate, by altering heat absorption patterns. The Siberian Traps region became a massive dark patch on the Earth's surface, soaking up sunlight and radiating heat, creating its own weather patterns, possibly affecting atmospheric circulation across the northern hemisphere. And remember, this wasn't happening all at once. The eruptions came in pulses that could last thousands of years, separated by quieter periods that might last tens of thousands of years. Each pulse would restart the catastrophe. Just when ecosystems were beginning to recover from the last eruption, when species were starting to recolonize devastated regions, when the climate was beginning to stabilize, boom, another pulse. More lava, more gas, more ash, more climate chaos. The dating of these pulses is still being refined, but the evidence suggests there were at least 2, possibly 3 major eruption phases. The first pulse, right at the Permian-Triassic boundary, was probably the most intense. This is when the main extinction event happened, when 90% of species disappeared in what might have been just a few tens of thousands of years. But the second pulse, coming maybe 300,000 years later, was almost as bad. It killed off many of the species that had managed to survive the first catastrophe, preventing any meaningful recovery. This prolonged nature of the eruptions is crucial to understanding why the Great Dying was so devastating. If it had been a single event, even a massive one, some ecosystems would have survived in refuges far from the volcanic province. The world is big. There would have been places to hide, regions where conditions remain tolerable, populations that could ride out the storm and then repopulate when things improved. But a million years of repeated catastrophes, that's a different situation entirely. There are no refugees that can protect you for a million years. There are no safe zones when the entire planet's climate is being repeatedly destabilized. Every time life tried to recover, another pulse would hammer it back down. It's like trying to swim to safety while someone keeps pushing your head back underwater. Eventually, even the strongest swimmers drown. The Siberian Traps eruptions were geological in scale but biological in effect. They didn't just change the landscape, they changed the chemistry of the atmosphere and the oceans. They disrupted the carbon cycle, the sulfur cycle, the nitrogen cycle. They altered weather patterns, ocean currents, and atmospheric circulation. They created conditions that life on Earth had never experienced before and, thankfully, has never experienced since. By the time the main eruption phase finally ended, the world had been transformed. The Siberian region was buried under layers of basalt that would persist for hundreds of millions of years. The atmosphere was choked with greenhouse gases. The oceans were becoming toxic, and life on Earth was on the brink of total collapse. But the eruptions themselves were just the trigger, just the first domino falling in a chain reaction that would cascade through every ecosystem on the planet. What happened next was even worse, because once the eruptions destabilized the climate system, other processes took over. Processes that would turn a regional catastrophe into a global apocalypse. The Siberian Traps had opened the gates of hell. Now, the real dying could begin. The volcanism was just the beginning. What happened next was something the Earth had never experienced before and hopefully will never experience again. Because here's the thing about massive volcanic eruptions that last for hundreds of thousands of years. They don't just add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. They fundamentally break the climate system. They push the planet past tipping points that trigger cascading failures in every system that keeps the world habitable. And during the Great Dying, every single one of those systems collapsed at once. Let's start with the most obvious effect: heat. The Siberian Traps released so much carbon dioxide that global temperatures rose by 10 to 15 degrees Celsius. Now, that might not sound catastrophic. You might think, okay, the world got hotter, life adapts, right? Wrong. Because we're not talking about a gradual warming that happens over millions of years, giving evolution time to work. We're talking about planetary scale heating that happened in maybe 60,000 years, which in geological terms is basically instant. And we're not talking about warming that affects some regions while leaving others as refugees. We're talking about warming that made vast portions of the planet literally uninhabitable. Picture what 10 degrees of warming actually means. Take the hottest day you've ever experienced. Now add 10 degrees Celsius. That's 18 degrees Fahrenheit if you're counting. Suddenly, places that used to be warm become deadly. Places that were hot become hell on earth. And places that were already near the limits of what complex life could tolerate. They became killing zones where nothing could survive for long. The tropics, which should have been refuges teeming with life, became death traps. Temperatures in equatorial regions during the Permian were already warm, probably averaging around 30 to 35 degrees Celsius. Add 10 to 15 degrees, and you're looking at average temperatures of 40 to 50 degrees Celsius. That's 122 degrees Fahrenheit, as an average. Not a heat wave. Not an unusually hot day. The normal temperature, day after day, month after month, year after year. At those temperatures, most complex life simply can't function. Proteins denature. Cellular processes break down. Animals that couldn't escape to cooler regions died. Plants that had evolved for millions of years to thrive in tropical warmth cooked in the ground. Forests that had stood for eons turned brown and died, their dried remains becoming fuel for wildfires that raged across continents. The fossil record from tropical regions during the extinction shows this with brutal clarity. layer after layer of rock with almost nothing in it. No shells, no bones, no plant fossils, just empty sediment marking years when nothing lived, nothing died, nothing left any trace of its existence. But the killing heat wasn't even the worst of it, because the warming didn't just make the world hotter, it broke the ocean's circulation systems that had kept the planet's climate stable for hundreds of millions of years. Under normal conditions, Earth's oceans are constantly mixing. Cold, dense water sinks at the poles and flows along the ocean floor toward the equator. Warm surface water moves from the tropics toward the poles to replace it. This circulation pattern, called thermohaline circulation, does more than just move water around. It distributes heat across the planet, moderating temperatures. It brings nutrients from the deep ocean to the surface, feeding marine ecosystems. It keeps oxygen circulating throughout the ocean depths, allowing life to exist even miles below the surface. The warming killed it, completely. As polar regions heated up, the temperature difference between the poles and the equator decreased. That temperature gradient is what drives ocean circulation. Weaken it, and circulation slows. Eliminate it almost entirely, and circulation stops. By the peak of the warming, the poles weren't much cooler than the tropics. The ocean stopped mixing. Surface water sat on top of deep water like oil on vinegar. No nutrients circulated from depth to surface. No oxygen penetrated to the ocean floor. The deep ocean became stagnant, a vast pool of still water that would soon turn toxic in ways we'll explore later. But the surface wasn't much better. Without circulation to distribute heat, the oceans became like patchwork quilts of temperature zones. Some areas got so hot that they were basically marine deserts, too warm for most life to survive. Other areas experienced wild temperature fluctuations as storm systems and seasonal changes created temporary cooling, followed by brutal heating. Marine life that had evolved to handle relatively stable temperatures found itself facing conditions that changed faster than it could adapt. The atmospheric circulation patterns collapsed too. Earth's weather systems depend on temperature differences to drive winds and storms. Hot air rises at the equator, flows toward the poles at high altitude, cools, sinks, and returns at low altitude. This creates the trade winds, the jet streams, the monsoons, all the regular weather patterns that make different parts of the planet predictable. Weaken the temperature gradient and you weaken the circulation. The trade winds faltered. The jet streams became sluggish and unstable. Weather patterns that had been reliable for millions of years became chaotic and unpredictable. But most devastating of all was what happened to the monsoons. Before the extinction, Pangaea's interior regions depended on seasonal monsoons to bring rain from the coasts inland. These weren't like modern monsoons. These were mega monsoons. Massive atmospheric rivers that could carry moisture thousands of miles into the continental interior. They were the only thing that kept vast regions of Pangaea from being complete desert. The warming intensified them to the point of destruction. Here's why. Warmer air can hold more moisture, a lot more. For every degree Celsius of warming, the atmosphere can hold about 7% more water vapour. 10 degrees of warming meant the atmosphere could hold 70% more moisture. 70%. When that moisture-laden air finally hit the right conditions to release its water, it didn't fall as regular rain. It fell as biblical deluges that could last for weeks or months. Floods that carved new channels through the landscape, washing away soil that had taken millions of years to form, destroying habitats, drowning anything that couldn't escape to high ground. But between these catastrophic wet seasons came dry seasons that were equally deadly. Because that 70% more moisture capacity meant the atmosphere could also dry things out 70% faster. Regions that had been merely dry became absolute deserts. Plants that had survived previous droughts withered and died. Water sources that had been reliable for millennia dried up completely. The fossil record shows this pattern. Flood deposits filled with debris, followed immediately by wind-blown desert sand. Back and forth, drowning and desiccation, killing anything that had managed to survive one extreme before the next one hit. Interior Pangaea, which had already been semi-arid before the extinction, became truly hellish. Temperatures regularly exceeded 50 degrees Celsius. Rainfall, when it came as catastrophic floods. The rest of the time, the land baked under a sun that seemed to grow more brutal every year. Deserts expanded from the continental interior toward the coasts, consuming everything in their path. The fossil record from these regions is almost completely barren. Whatever had lived there before the extinction was simply erased. But wait, there's more. Because the volcanic CO2 wasn't the only greenhouse gas wreaking havoc. The warming triggered one of the most terrifying feedback loops in Earth's climate system, the release of methane from frozen deposits. During the Permian, vast amounts of methane were locked away in two types of deposits. First, in permafrost, frozen ground in high-latitude regions where methane from decaying organic matter had been trapped in ice for millions of years. Second, in methane clathrates, ice-like structures on the ocean floor where methane molecules are trapped in cages of frozen water. Both are stable only at low temperatures. Warm them up and they release their methane. And methane is a far more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Molecule for molecule, it traps about 80 times more heat. As the planet warmed from volcanic CO2, it warmed enough to destabilize these methane deposits. The permafrost melted. The clathrates broke down. Millions of tons of methane bubbled up from the ocean floor and melted out of frozen ground, adding even more warming on top of the volcanic heating. This created a feedback loop that would have been obvious to anyone watching if there had been anyone around to watch. Warming releases methane. Methane causes more warming releases more methane causes more warming. Round and round, each cycle pushing temperatures higher, each temperature increase triggering more methane release, each methane release pushing temperatures higher still. The geochemical evidence for this shows up in the rock record as a distinctive pattern called a carbon isotope excursion. The ratio of different carbon isotopes shifts dramatically at the exact time of the extinction, and shifts in exactly the way you'd expect if massive amounts of biologically derived methane were being released into the atmosphere. It's like a smoking gun, except instead of smoke, it's methane, and instead of a gun, it's a climate bomb that pushed the planet past multiple tipping points at once. By the peak of the extinction, the Earth had blown past the point where normal climate feedbacks could stabilize things. Under normal conditions, when the planet warms, increased plant growth and enhanced rock weathering gradually pull CO2 back out of the atmosphere, cooling things down again. These negative feedbacks keep the climate system stable over long timescales, but there's a limit to how much warming they can compensate for. Push past that limit, and positive feedbacks take over. Warming that triggers more warming. Destabilization that triggers more destabilization. A runaway train with no brakes accelerating toward catastrophe. The Great Dying pushed well past that limit. With the thermohaline circulation shut down, the ocean couldn't absorb excess heat efficiently. With atmospheric circulation weakened, heat couldn't distribute evenly around the planet. With methane releases adding to volcanic CO2, greenhouse gas concentrations just kept climbing. With massive die-offs of plants and marine life, the biological processes that normally help regulate atmospheric chemistry collapsed. Every system that might have provided a brake on warming had failed. Every feedback that might have stabilized things had been overwhelmed. The climate system had entered a state that scientists call hypothermal, a period of extreme, sustained, uncontrollable heating that would last for hundreds of thousands of years, And here's the truly terrifying part. It was self-sustaining. Even if the Siberian Traps had shut off completely, even if not one more drop of lava had erupted, the warming would have continued. The methane releases alone would have been enough to keep temperatures elevated. The stagnant oceans would have remained stagnant. The disrupted circulation patterns would have stayed disrupted. The planet had entered a new stable state, except this stable state was hell. Life that had evolved over hundreds of millions of years to thrive in a stable, relatively cool climate, suddenly found itself in a world that bore no resemblance to the one its ancestors had known. Temperature zones shifted hundreds or thousands of miles in just a few generations. Rainfall patterns became completely unpredictable. Seasonal cycles that had governed reproduction and migration for millions of years broke down entirely. The rules of survival that had worked forever stopped working. Some organisms tried to adapt by migrating, but there was nowhere to go. The poles weren't cool refuges anymore. They were merely less brutally hot than the tropics. The interior continents weren't dry but habitable. They were absolute deserts where nothing could survive. The coasts, which should have provided moderate conditions buffered by the ocean, were subject to wild swings between catastrophic flooding and extreme drought. There were no good options, no safe havens, no territories that offered the stable conditions complex life requires. Others tried to adapt by evolving heat tolerance, but evolution takes time, and the warming was too fast. A species might develop the ability to tolerate temperatures a few degrees higher than its ancestors. But by the time that adaptation spread through the population, temperatures had risen several more degrees. It was like trying to climb a mountain while the mountain grows faster than you can climb. You never get any closer to the top. You just get more and more exhausted until you can't continue. The fossil record from the peak of the extinction shows the results with brutal clarity. Species that had been abundant for millions of years vanish in a geological instant. Entire ecosystems that had been stable for ages collapse within a few tens of thousands of years. Tropical forests disappear. Coral reefs die. The megafauna that had dominated terrestrial environments are replaced by almost nothing. Just a few hardy survivors eking out existence in a world that had become fundamentally hostile to complex life. And this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Because the climate catastrophe didn't kill most species directly. It set the stage for an even more terrible killer that would turn the oceans into toxic death zones and push the extinction to truly apocalyptic levels. But that comes next. For now, just understand, the world had become hell, and it was about to get worse. But the atmospheric nightmare was just the beginning. Because here's the thing about a planet-wide climate catastrophe. Nothing happens in isolation. The same volcanic gases that were poisoning the air and cooking the atmosphere were also attacking the oceans. And what happened there was somehow even worse. Picture the oceans of the late Permian as the temperature started climbing. For millions of years, they'd been normal, healthy marine ecosystems. Cold water near the poles sinking and flowing along the ocean floor toward the equator. Warm surface water moving poleward to replace it. This global circulation system, what oceanographers call the thermohaline circulation, was like the planet's cardiovascular system, constantly mixing oxygen-rich surface water with the depths, keeping the entire ocean alive. Then the warming started, and the oceans began to die. The first problem was simple physics. Warm water holds less dissolved oxygen than cold water. This isn't theory, it's chemistry. The warmer water gets, the less oxygen can physically dissolve into it. Under normal conditions, this isn't catastrophic. Ocean circulation compensates. Cold, oxygen-rich water from the poles sinks and replaces the warm, oxygen-poor water at depth. But as global temperatures climbed 10, 12, 15 degrees Celsius above normal, something fundamental broke. The poles stopped being cold. Arctic and Antarctic waters that had been near freezing for millions of years were now warm enough to support tropical species. There was no more cold, dense water to sink and drive the circulation. The oceans began to stratify. Warm, oxygen-depleted water floating on top. Deeper, slightly cooler water trapped below. Between them, a thermocline, a temperature boundary layer that acted like an invisible barrier preventing mixing. Surface water that did contain some oxygen couldn't sink. Deep water that was running out of oxygen couldn't rise to be replenished. Within centuries, maybe decades, the deeper parts of the ocean began experiencing something that hadn't happened on a global scale for hundreds of millions of years: anoxia, the complete absence of dissolved oxygen. Now, you might think an ocean without oxygen would just be empty, a sterile zone where nothing lives. But that's not what happened. Because there are organisms that don't need oxygen. In fact, there are organisms that are poisoned by oxygen, bacteria that had dominated Earth's oceans for billions of years before oxygen-breathing life evolved. They've been waiting in the deep places, in the mud and sediments where oxygen never reaches, surviving on chemical reactions that don't require breathing. Most of the time they're restricted to these tiny refuges, unable to compete with more efficient oxygen-breathing organisms. But when the oxygen disappeared, when the deep oceans went anoxic, these ancient bacteria exploded across the ocean floor. They were anaerobic bacteria, and they processed sulfate from seawater using a metabolic pathway that produced a waste product: hydrogen sulfide. Hydrogen sulfide is the smell of rotten eggs, the stench of swamps and sewers. It's toxic to most oxygen-breathing life, even in tiny concentrations. The bacteria that produce it don't care. They've been making it for billions of years. Under normal conditions, what little hydrogen sulfide they produce gets neutralized by oxygen in the water, or oxidized by other bacteria before it can accumulate. But in the anoxic, deep waters of the dying Permian oceans, there was no oxygen to neutralize it. The hydrogen sulfide began accumulating, not in parts per million, but in massive concentrations that turned the deep oceans into a toxic chemical soup. Mile after mile of ocean floor becoming saturated with one of the deadliest poisons in nature. And then the circulation patterns that had broken down during the warming event began occasionally reasserting themselves. Not regularly, not predictably, but in catastrophic pulses. Underwater currents would shift. Storms would churn surface waters deeper than normal. Tides would pull differently. And when that happened, the hydrogen sulfide came up. Oceanographers call these events upwelling. Under normal circumstances, upwelling is good. It brings nutrient-rich deep water to the surface, feeding blooms of plankton that support entire marine food chains. But Permian upwelling wasn't bringing nutrients, it was bringing poison. When hydrogen sulfide reached the surface, it didn't just kill marine life directly, though it did that too. It fundamentally changed what could live in the water. The ocean's surface began hosting blooms of photosynthetic bacteria that could tolerate and even thrive in the presence of hydrogen sulfide. Purple sulfur bacteria and green sulfur bacteria, primitive organisms that use hydrogen sulfide the way plants use water. These bacterial blooms turned vast expanses of ocean purple and green, colours that would have been beautiful if they hadn't represented the death of everything else. Because wherever these bacteria dominated, nothing else could survive. Not fish, not plankton, not coral, not anything that breathed oxygen. Fossil evidence from late Permian marine deposits shows this transition clearly. Normal marine ecosystems disappear from the rock record. In their place, thin layers of sediment packed with the remains of bacterial mats. Purple and green bacterial blooms that stretched for thousands of miles, covering the ocean's surface like a toxic blanket. Coastal regions suffered worst. These were the zones where deep water naturally upwelled most, frequently. Bays and estuaries that had been nurseries for marine life became killing zones. The smell must have been unimaginable. Hydrogen sulfide in concentrations high enough to be toxic, drifting on shore with every breeze. Animals living near coasts would have been poisoned just by breathing the air. But it gets worse, because hydrogen sulfide is lighter than air. When concentrations in surface waters got high enough, it began outgassing into the atmosphere. Not just near coasts, but anywhere the toxic deep water reached the surface. The lower atmosphere, already choked with carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide from the volcanoes, began accumulating hydrogen sulfide as well. In the atmosphere, hydrogen sulfide reacts with oxygen and ultraviolet light. Under normal conditions, these reactions break down the hydrogen sulfide harmlessly. But the Permian atmosphere wasn't normal. The oxygen concentration was dropping from volcanic consumption and lack of plant photosynthesis. And hydrogen sulfide was being released faster than normal atmospheric chemistry could process it. Some of it reached the stratosphere, and there it began destroying the ozone layer. Ozone is that thin layer of modified oxygen molecules high in the atmosphere that shields Earth's surface from the worst of the sun's ultraviolet radiation. It's essential for surface life. Without it, UV radiation intense enough to damage DNA and kill cells reaches ground level. During the Great Dying, hydrogen sulfide emissions from poisoned oceans began tearing holes in this protective layer. The evidence is subtle but clear. Late Permian plant fossils show increased frequency of mutations and malformations consistent with UV damage. Spores develop thick protective walls. Some plant lineages develop UV-resistant compounds for the first time. This is the signature of life trying desperately to cope with increased radiation exposure. And while all this was happening in the water column and the air above, another chemical catastrophe was unfolding. Because the same carbon dioxide that was warming the planet was also dissolving into seawater, and when CO2 dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid. Ocean acidification. The term sounds technical and abstract until you realize what it means for marine life. Many organisms build shells and skeletons from calcium carbonate. Coral reefs, shellfish, countless species of plankton that form the base of marine food chains all depend on being able to extract calcium from seawater and combine it with carbonate to build their structures. But carbonic acid dissolves calcium carbonate. The more acidic the ocean becomes, the harder it is for organisms to build and maintain these structures. Eventually, the water becomes so acidic that calcium carbonate structures begin dissolving spontaneously, even while the organism is alive. In modern oceans, this process happens slowly. We can measure it, we can track it, but ecosystems have time to potentially adapt. In the Permian, it happened fast. Atmospheric carbon dioxide rose from normal levels to perhaps 2,000 parts per million or higher. The oceans absorbed massive quantities of this CO2, and the pH plummeted. Fossil evidence shows coral reefs, which had been building up for millions of years, suddenly stopping growth, then eroding, then disappearing entirely from the fossil record. Not just in one place, but globally. Every major reef system on the planet dying within a geological instant. The same thing happened to shellfish populations. Brachiopods, which had been among the dominant marine animals for hundreds of millions of years, went from ubiquitous to nearly extinct. Not because they were hunted or outcompeted, but because the ocean chemistry changed so drastically that their shells couldn't form properly. Planktonic organisms with calcium carbonate shells suffered catastrophically. These tiny creatures, many of them microscopic, had been the foundation of marine food chains. They photosynthesized near the surface, absorbed carbon dioxide, built their tiny shells, and when they died, sank to the ocean floor, carrying carbon with them. They were the ocean's biological pump, the mechanism that had been keeping atmospheric carbon dioxide in check for millions of years. When acidification killed them, the pump broke. Not only did food chains collapse from the bottom up, but the ocean lost its primary mechanism for absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. This created a feedback loop. More CO2 in the atmosphere meant more warming and more acidification, which killed more calcifying organisms, which meant less CO2 absorption, which meant more CO2 accumulation. The fossil record from marine deposits during the extinction shows this collapse in stark detail. Thick layers of limestone and chalk formed from the accumulated shells of countless tiny organisms suddenly give way to thin layers of clay. No shells, no reefs, no calcium carbonate structures at all. Just fine mud settling slowly in dead oceans. And because these planktonic organisms had been the base of the food chain, everything that depended on them began starving. Fish that fed on plankton died. Larger fish that fed on those fish died. Marine reptiles that hunted those larger fish died. The entire food web unravelling from the bottom up. Some organisms tried to adapt. Fossil evidence shows species evolving smaller body sizes, a common response to resource scarcity. Others developed shells with different chemistry, trying to use materials less vulnerable to acidification. But evolution takes time, thousands of generations to produce meaningful adaptations. The ocean chemistry was changing faster than most species could evolve. In some regions, the situation became even more nightmarish. Where anoxic waters met oxygenated surface layers, where hydrogen sulfide plumes encountered water that still contained some oxygen, the chemistry became absolutely lethal. The boundary. Zones hosted blooms of bacteria that could metabolize both oxygen and sulfur compounds, creating a toxic middle layer that nothing could pass through alive. Marine animals trying to dive deeper to escape warm surface waters would hit this toxic boundary and die. Deeper organisms trying to move toward the surface would encounter the same barrier from below. Entire populations found themselves trapped in shrinking zones of survivable water, squeezed between toxic layers above and below. The few organisms that survived were those with extreme flexibility. Some fish species developed the ability to gulp air from the surface, bypassing the need for dissolved oxygen entirely. Some invertebrates evolved tolerance to low oxygen conditions that would have killed their ancestors. Some mobile species simply fled, migrating toward the few remaining zones where ocean chemistry still permitted life. But these refugees were small and shrinking. Maybe some high-latitude regions where cooling from altitude or ocean currents maintained slightly better conditions. Perhaps some isolated basins where local circulation patterns kept oxygen levels just barely high enough. Small pockets of survivability in a dying ocean. For millions of years, the oceans had been Earth's largest reservoir of life. Now they were a planet-wide toxic waste dump. Anoxic at depth, poisonous at the surface, acidic throughout, and laced with hydrogen sulfide that killed anything unlucky enough to encounter it. The purple and green bacterial blooms spreading across the surface were like a shroud covering a corpse. And the worst part? This wasn't temporary. The volcanic eruptions that had triggered the cascade were still ongoing, still pumping carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere. The warming was still accelerating. The anoxia was still spreading. The hydrogen sulfide production was still increasing. The ocean's death spiral was nowhere near its bottom. What had been the planet's largest ecosystem, covering 70% of Earth's surface, hosting the vast majority of life's biomass and diversity, had become a toxic soup that killed almost everything it touched. The seas hadn't just turned deadly, they had turned into something that shouldn't exist on a living world. But somehow, somewhere, in the tiny slivers of ocean that remained even marginally habitable, a few species were hanging on. waiting, enduring, hoping that eventually somehow the chemistry would shift back towards something that could support life again. They had no way of knowing it would take millions of years. But here's the thing about ecosystems. They don't die all at once, they unravel. Thread by thread, species by species, relationship by relationship. And once the unraveling starts, it accelerates. Because ecosystems aren't just collections of organisms living in the same place. They're networks of dependencies, webs of relationships where every species depends on dozens of others. Remove one thread, and the whole thing starts to come apart. The first casualties were the organisms nobody thinks about, but that make everything else possible. The filter feeders. Those humble marine creatures that spend their lives straining microscopic organisms from seawater. Brachiopods, bryozoans, crinoids, countless species of small shellfish that form the foundation of marine food webs. They were dying by the billions. These weren't dramatic deaths. No massive die-offs visible from shore, just steady decline as ocean chemistry turned against them. The carbon dioxide that had dissolved into seawater was making it more acidic, eating away at their calcium carbonate shells. Every generation found it harder to build protective covering. Shells became thinner, more fragile, more easily crushed by predators or broken by waves. And here's the cruel mathematics of it. Building shells requires energy. The more energy you have to spend maintaining your shell in acidic water, the less you have for reproduction. Population growth slows. Deaths start outnumbering births. And then, quietly, over just a few thousand years, species that had dominated the oceans for hundreds of millions of years simply stop existing. But their extinction didn't just mean fewer filter feeders. It meant the collapse of everything that depended on them. The fish that ate them, the larger fish that ate those fish, the marine reptiles at the top of the food chain, every level of the food web shaking as the foundation crumbled. The reef builders went next. Corals and sponges that had constructed the Permian equivalent of modern coral reefs, massive underwater structures that provided habitat for thousands of species. They were calcium carbonate organisms too, just as vulnerable to ocean acidification. But they also faced another problem: temperature. Reefs exist in a narrow temperature range. Too cold and they can't grow. Too hot and they bleach, expelling the symbiotic organisms they depend on for nutrition, dying slowly of starvation even as they remain anchored to the reef structure. The warming oceans of the Great Dying pushed tropical reefs past their thermal tolerance. Reef systems that had taken millions of years to build began dying. Not everywhere at once, but in patches. The healthier sections persisting longest, the most stressed areas bleaching first. But once enough of the reef died, the survivors couldn't maintain the structure. Waves began breaking apart dead coral. Sediment buried bleached sections. Within a few thousand years, vast reef complexes that had stretched for hundreds of miles were reduced to rubble fields on the ocean floor. The loss cascaded upward through the ecosystem. Reef fish lost their habitat and their spawning grounds. Species that had evolved to live exclusively in reef environments had nowhere else to go. Predators that hunted reef fish found their prey disappearing. And the physical reefs themselves, those massive structures, had protected coastlines from storm, surge and erosion. Without them, ocean waves began hammering directly against the land, accelerating coastal degradation and pushing marine ecosystems into even more marginal conditions. On land, the forests were dying, not from fire, though there was plenty of that, but from simple heat stress. Trees that had evolved to tolerate Permian climates suddenly found themselves in a world 10 degrees Celsius, hotter than anything their physiology could handle. Leaves wilted even in full shade. Sap began to boil in trunks during the hottest days. Root systems, evolved to draw water from soil at certain depths, found the water table dropping below their reach. And here's what's devastating about tree death. Trees don't just die and disappear, they fall. Massive trunks that had stood for centuries crashing to the forest floor, taking other vegetation with them, opening the canopy to baking sunlight that kills shade-adapted species, creating enormous amounts of dead wood that becomes tinder for the next wildfire. But the real catastrophe wasn't the death of individual trees, it was the loss of what forests do. They hold soil in place with their root systems. Without them, the next rainstorm, in the few places where it still rained, washed topsoil downhill. Rivers ran brown with sediment. Nutrients that had taken thousands of years to accumulate in forest soils flushed away in single flood events. Coastal areas where rivers met the sea became choked with sediment, burying nearshore marine habitats under meters of mud. The nutrient runoff created another problem. All that organic matter and mineral nutrients flooding into the oceans should have been a bounty for marine life. Instead, it became a poison. Algae bloomed in massive quantities, feeding on the nutrients, then died, their bodies sinking to the ocean floor where bacteria decomposed them, consuming oxygen in the process. Vast dead zones spread across the ocean floor and began creeping upward toward the surface. Fish that could swim fled to shrinking zones of oxygenated water. Bottom dwellers simply suffocated. The terrestrial food chains were collapsing from multiple directions at once. Plants were struggling in the heat, producing fewer leaves, fewer seeds, less food for herbivores. The herbivores, massive four-legged synapsids that had been the dominant large animals of the Permian, found themselves in a world where every meal required more energy to find. They had to range farther, travelling through increasingly barren landscapes searching for enough vegetation to survive. This burned calories they could barely replace. Adults stopped reproducing. Juveniles died of starvation. Population densities plummeted. This should have been good news for predators. Fewer herbivores means less competition for prey. Except the mathematics don't work that way. Predators need a minimum prey density to survive. If you're a large carnivore, you need to catch enough prey to justify the energy you spend hunting. When prey becomes too scattered, too rare, you burn more calories searching than you gain from successful hunts. You enter a death spiral. The large predators of the Permian, the gorgonopsids and other fearsome carnivores that had ruled the food chain, died hard. These weren't animals that could switch diets easily. Evolution had spent millions of years perfecting them as predators. Their teeth were designed for killing and tearing meat. Their metabolisms required high-protein diets. Their hunting strategies depended on specific prey behaviors. When their prey disappeared, they had nowhere to turn, no evolutionary backup plan. The archaeological record from this period shows something heartbreaking. Predator remains with signs of starvation, bone density that indicates malnutrition during their final months. These were apex predators, animals that should have been fat and healthy at the top of the food chain, dying of hunger in a world where they no longer belonged. As the forests fell and the megafauna died, something else took over the landscape. Fungi. Not the mushrooms we think of today, but massive fungal mats that spread across the dying vegetation like a living carpet. The geologic record from the Great Dying shows a worldwide spike in fungal remains, a fungal spike that lasted for thousands of years. Think about what that means. In healthy ecosystems, fungi play important roles, but they're kept in check by other organisms. Plants resist fungal infection. Animals eat fungal fruiting bodies. Bacteria compete for the same dead organic matter. But in the dying world of the Permian, those checks and balances collapsed. Dead trees, dead animals, dead plants everywhere. Mountains of organic matter with nothing to eat it except fungi. They exploded across the landscape, fungal networks spreading through dead wood, sending up fruiting bodies that released billions of spores, those spores settling on living plants and accelerating their death. More dead vegetation, more substrate for fungal growth, a positive feedback loop where death fed more death. For thousands of years, vast regions of the planet were dominated by fungal decomposer communities, landscapes that looked like something from a nightmare. Dead grey forests covered in fungal mats, releasing clouds of spores when the wind blew. This wasn't an ecosystem anymore. This was a graveyard being slowly processed by the ultimate decomposers. But here's the thing, not everywhere was dying. The planet is vast, and the catastrophe, while global, wasn't uniformly intense. There were refuges, places where geography and climate combined to create survivable conditions. The polar regions, though they were warming too, remained cooler than the tropics. High-altitude areas, mountains tall enough to reach into cooler air, provided temperature refuges. Certain coastal areas where ocean currents still brought cool water could maintain more moderate temperatures. These refuges were tiny compared to the dying zones, maybe 5% of the planet's surface, maybe less. But they were enough. Species that could reach these refuges had a chance. Populations that had been widespread contracted to tiny holdouts. Animals and plants that had once ranged across continents found themselves restricted to single mountain valleys or isolated coastal strips. The genetic bottlenecks this created were extreme. Populations that had numbered millions reduced to thousands or hundreds. All that genetic diversity built up over millions of years of evolution collapsed. The survivors were whoever happened to be close enough to a refuge to reach it, whoever had the physiological tolerance to survive in marginal conditions, whoever got lucky. And here's what's remarkable. Size became a liability. The massive herbivores and predators that had dominated Permian ecosystems were among the first to die. They needed more food, more territory, more resources to maintain their populations. These survivors tended to be smaller, organisms that could subsist on less food, survive in smaller territories, reproduce more quickly when conditions improved. Insects were among the great survivors. Their small size meant they needed less food. Their short generation times meant they could adapt quickly to changing conditions. Their ability to enter dormant states let them wait out the worst conditions. Flying species could search vast areas for the scattered pockets of edible vegetation. Ground dwellers could shelter in burrows where temperatures remained more stable. Some small reptiles survived by similar strategies. Species that could burrow, that could lower their metabolic rates, that could subsist on insects and dead organic matter. They weren't thriving. They were barely hanging on. But barely hanging on was enough to see the other side of the catastrophe. The marine recovery lagged far behind the terrestrial recovery, and this created a feedback loop that extended the crisis by millions of years. On land, once the volcanic eruptions finally began to wane and atmospheric carbon dioxide levels started to stabilize, conditions began improving relatively quickly. Vegetation could recolonize in decades or centuries. Insects could rebuild populations in years. But the oceans were another matter entirely. The problem was scale. The ocean is huge. It contains 97% of Earth's water, and all that water had absorbed enormous quantities of carbon dioxide, changing its chemistry fundamentally. Ocean acidification doesn't reverse quickly. Even after atmospheric CO2 levels began dropping, the oceans remained acidic. They would need thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, to exchange their water with the atmosphere and gradually return to normal pH levels. But it was worse than just waiting for chemistry to improve. The dead zones, those vast expanses of oxygen-depleted water, persisted long after the initial crisis. They'd been created by organic matter, Runoff and algae blooms, but once established, they became self-sustaining. Anaerobic bacteria thriving in the oxygen-depleted water produced hydrogen sulfide, a poison that kept aerobic organisms away. The dead zones expanded. Some reached the surface, creating vast areas of purple ocean where hydrogen sulfide-producing bacteria turned the water colour. Any marine organism that ventured into these dead zones died. Their bodies settled to the ocean floor, providing more organic matter for bacterial decomposition, which consumed more oxygen, which expanded the dead zone, a vicious cycle that would take millions of years to break. So while terrestrial ecosystems began their slow recovery within a few 100,000 years of the volcanism ending, marine ecosystems remained locked in a state of collapse. The few surviving marine species were restricted to isolated pockets of oxygenated water, populations that couldn't expand, gene pools that couldn't diversify, evolution essentially frozen because the environment remained too hostile for innovation. This had profound implications for the entire planet's recovery. Healthy oceans drive global climate. They absorb heat, redistribute it through currents, influence rainfall patterns. Oceans full of life process nutrients produce oxygen, regulate atmospheric chemistry. The dead, stagnant oceans of the post-Permian world couldn't perform these functions. The climate remained unstable. Temperature swings remained extreme. The planet couldn't fully recover until its oceans recovered. And the oceans couldn't recover until the dead zones disappeared. Which couldn't happen until ocean chemistry improved. Which couldn't happen until atmospheric carbon finally returned to normal levels. A cascade of dependencies that stretched the recovery out across geological timescales. It would take 10 million years before marine ecosystems even began to resemble their pre-extinction complexity. 10 million years before reefs started to redevelop, before food chains rebuilt themselves, before the ocean could once again support the diversity of life it had held before the Great Dying. But that recovery, when it finally came, would be different. The ecosystems that emerged from the ashes weren't reconstructions of what had been lost. They were something new, built by the survivors, the species that had been tough enough, lucky enough, adaptable enough to make it through the worst extinction event in Earth's history. And those survivors had learned something, or rather, evolution had selected for something. The ability to survive catastrophe was now written into the genetic code of every species that came after. But here's the thing about extinction events. They never kill everything. 96% of marine species disappeared. 70% of terrestrial vertebrates vanished. But that means 4% of ocean life survived. 30% of land animals made it through. The question isn't just who died, it's who survived. And more importantly, why? Because the answer to that question tells us something fundamental about life itself, about what it takes to endure when the world is literally ending around you. Picture the landscape 251 million years ago, just after the dying stopped. You're standing on what used to be a lush river delta, full of vegetation and animal life. Now it's a wasteland. The soil is grey and dead, stripped of nutrients, scattered bones bleach in the sun, remains of animals that died months or years ago. The air is still toxic, though not as poisonous as it was at the height of the catastrophe. And then you see movement. Something small, about the size of a pig, waddling across the barren ground. It has a squat body, short legs, and a beak-like snout. It's digging, snuffling through the dead soil, looking for any scrap of organic matter it can eat. This is Lystrosaurus, and for the next 5 million years, it will be the most successful land animal on the planet. Lystrosaurus was a mammal-like reptile technically called a dicynodont. Before the extinction, it had been just one of dozens of similar species. Nothing special, not the biggest, not the fastest, not the most specialized. just a medium-sized herbivore that could eat almost anything plant-based and survive in a variety of environments. But those characteristics, the ones that made it unremarkable before the catastrophe, those were exactly what made it perfect for surviving after. Because here's what the fossil record shows. In the immediate aftermath of the Great Dying, Lystrosaurus made up 95% of all terrestrial vertebrate fossils, not 95% of herbivores, not 95% of reptiles, 95% of all land animals with backbones. The entire world had become Lystrosaurus world. Why? What made this unassuming creature so successful when everything else was dying? First, size. Lystrosaurus was small, at least compared to many of the animals that went extinct. Most species weighed between 20 and 90 pounds. Small body size meant low food requirements. When vegetation was scarce and every calorie mattered, being small was an enormous advantage. You needed less food to maintain body temperature, less food to power movement, less food to reproduce. A large predator might need to eat 10% of its body weight every day. Lystrosaurus could survive on scraps. Second, metabolism. As a mammal-like reptile, Lystrosaurus had a metabolism somewhere between cold-blooded reptiles and warm-blooded mammals. It could regulate its body temperature somewhat, but it didn't burn calories as fast as true warm-blooded animals. This metabolic flexibility meant it could be active when conditions were good, hunting for food and reproducing, but it could also slow down dramatically during harsh periods, reducing its energy needs to almost nothing. Think of it like having a car that can run on premium fuel when available, but can also switch to economy mode and get 200 miles per gallon when necessary. That kind of efficiency was life or death in the post-extinction world. Third, diet. Lystrosaurus wasn't picky. Its beak-like mouth could process tough, fibrous plant material. It could eat roots, digging them up with its powerful front limbs. It could consume fungi, which were probably one of the most abundant food sources in the immediate aftermath, growing on all that dead plant matter. It could even eat soil, extracting whatever organic content remained. When you can eat almost anything, you survive conditions that would starve specialists. Fourth, behavior. Fossil evidence suggests Lystrosaurus was a burrower. Its robust front limbs and compact body were perfect for digging. And burrowing was perhaps the single most important survival skill during the extinction. Underground, you escaped the worst temperature extremes. Underground, you found moisture even when the surface was baked dry. Underground, you avoided toxic gases that accumulated at ground level. Most importantly, underground, you could estivate, entering a hibernation-like state that allowed you to wait out the worst conditions without depleting your energy reserves. Some Lystrosaurus burrows show multiple occupation layers, suggesting animals returned to the same refuges year after year, generation after generation, while the surface world remained inhospitable. But Lystrosaurus wasn't alone. Other survivors shared similar characteristics. Take the small reptiles that made it through. Most were insectivores with generalist diets. They could eat any arthropod they could catch. They were small enough to hide in crevices and burrows, and critically, they laid eggs with tough, leathery shells that could survive weeks or months of drought. This reproductive strategy was crucial. Live birth, which some advanced reptiles had evolved by the late Permian, required the mother to provide continuous resources to developing young. If you were starving, you couldn't reproduce, but egg-laying decoupled reproduction from immediate resource availability. You could produce eggs during brief favourable periods, then the eggs could wait, sometimes for months, until conditions improved enough for them to hatch. It was like having a biological pause button that let you spread reproduction across time, increasing the chances that at least some offspring would hatch during survivable conditions. In the oceans, the survivors tell a similar story. The worst-hit environments were reef ecosystems and the deep ocean, but some zones escaped the worst effects. Shallow coastal waters that were well mixed and oxygenated could support life even during the anoxia. Certain deep-sea trenches, isolated by geography and ocean currents, maintained pockets of oxygenated water. These refugia became lifeboats for marine species, and the animals that occupied them shared predictable characteristics. Small body size again, low metabolic rates, ability to tolerate variable conditions. The brachiopods, those ancient shellfish that had dominated Permian seas, nearly went extinct. But a few species survived in isolated refugia. They had shells that could seal completely, allowing them to wait out anoxic periods. They could filter feed on whatever organic particles drifted by. They didn't need much to survive, just enough. Some survivors were what biologists call living fossils, species that have remained virtually unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. Horseshoe crabs, for example. They existed before the Great Dying. They survived it. And 251 million years later, they're still here, virtually identical to their Permian ancestors. Why? Because their survival strategy was so effective it never needed to change. Horseshoe crabs can survive in low oxygen water. They can go weeks without eating. They can tolerate extreme temperature variations. They reproduce by laying thousands of eggs in shallow water, playing the numbers game. Most offspring die, but with thousands produced each year, enough survive. That strategy worked before the extinction. It worked during the extinction. It still works today. Coelacanths are another example. These ancient fish were thought to have gone extinct with the dinosaurs until fishermen caught one off South Africa in 1938. Turns out they'd been surviving in deep ocean refugia for over 400 million years, including through the Great Dying. Their secret? Living in deep, stable environments where conditions change slowly, having a low metabolic rate that let them survive on minimal food, being generalist predators that could eat almost any fish or squid they encountered. When the surface world was burning, the deep ocean, despite its anoxia in many regions, maintained some pockets where life could persist. And the coelacanths, already adapted to low oxygen, low light conditions, were perfectly suited to ride out the catastrophe in their deep water refuges. Insects survived remarkably well, all things considered. Yes, many species went extinct, but insects as a group made it through with their diversity largely intact. Why? Size again. A beetle requires almost no food compared to a vertebrate. Life cycle flexibility. Many insects can enter dormant states as eggs, larvae, or adults, waiting months or years for conditions to improve. Reproductive speed. Once conditions improved even slightly, insects could explode in population, producing multiple generations per year. And diet. Many insects are detritivores, eating dead plant and animal matter. In the aftermath of the extinction, when dead organic material covered the landscape, these insects suddenly had an enormous food supply. They probably thrived during the early recovery period, which is exactly what the fossil record suggests. But here's what's really remarkable about the survivors. They weren't just lucky. They had been pre-adapted for catastrophe by previous smaller environmental challenges. Lystrosaurus had evolved its burrowing abilities and generalist diet long before the eruption started, probably as adaptations to seasonal droughts and resource variability. The reptiles with drought-resistant eggs had developed that strategy to deal with normal dry seasons. The deep ocean fish were already adapted to low oxygen. None of them evolved their survival traits during the extinction. That would have been impossible. Evolution by natural selection takes many generations, and the extinction happened too fast. Instead, they survived because they already had, through evolutionary accident, the exact traits needed to endure the catastrophe. It's like being the one person at a party who happens to be wearing a raincoat when a freak storm hits. You didn't wear the raincoat because you predicted the storm. You just got lucky that your existing choice happened to be perfect for unexpected circumstances. This tells us something profound about extinction and survival. It's not about being the strongest or the smartest or the most specialized. It's about being flexible, being generalist, being able to tolerate variable conditions. The creatures that went extinct during the Great Dying weren't inferior. Many were magnificently adapted to their environments. The gorgonopsids were apex predators, perfectly designed for hunting. The pariasaurs were superbly adapted for processing enormous quantities of vegetation. The reef-building organisms had created the most productive ecosystems in the ocean, but they were specialists. They required specific conditions to survive, and when those conditions disappeared, they had nowhere to go. The survivors were different. They were the species that could survive anywhere, eat anything, tolerate conditions that would kill more specialized organisms. They were life's insurance policy against catastrophe, existing in the background during normal times, but ready to inherit the Earth when everything went wrong. And inherit it they did. For 5 million years after the extinction, Lystrosaurus and its fellow survivors occupied an emptied world. Competition was minimal. Predators were scarce. Resources, once the initial catastrophe passed, were abundant relative to the tiny populations that had survived. It was like being given the keys to an entire planet with almost nobody else around. Some Lystrosaurus populations spread across Pangaea, travelling thousands of miles into territories that had been occupied by dozens of other species before the extinction. Fossils of essentially identical Lystrosaurus have been found in South Africa, Antarctica, India, China, and Russia. For a slow-moving herbivorous animal, that kind of distribution is unprecedented. It could only happen in a world where competition and predation pressure had collapsed, where you could walk for weeks without encountering another large animal, where every territory was effectively empty, waiting to be colonized. But slowly, very slowly, things began to change. The survivors started evolving, adapting, diversifying. New species emerged from the Lystrosaurus lineage. Some became larger, others developed new feeding strategies. Predators re-evolved from small survivors, gradually growing bigger as prey populations recovered. The empty world was filling up again. Life was learning to live again, but it would take millions of years for biodiversity to recover, millions of years for ecosystems to rebuild the complexity that had been lost. The survivors had made it through. They had clung to existence when existence itself seemed impossible. Now they faced an equally daunting challenge, rebuilding a world from almost nothing. The Great Dying ended 252 million years ago. The Siberian Traps finally quieted, their million-year tantrum of volcanic fury subsiding into occasional rumbles. The toxic clouds that had choked the atmosphere for millennia began to clear. Ocean temperatures, which had reached bathtub levels at the surface, started gradually cooling. The carbon dioxide levels that had turned seas into fizzy death traps began ever so slowly to decline. The worst was over. Life had survived. The planet would recover. Except here's the thing. Recovery from the Great Dying took longer than any other mass extinction event in Earth's history. Not just a little longer, dramatically, catastrophically longer. Most mass extinctions, even severe ones, show ecosystem recovery within 1 to 3 million years. After the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs, ecosystems were bouncing back within 2 million years. New species filling empty niches, food webs rebuilding, diversity returning, the biosphere demonstrating its remarkable capacity to heal itself. The Great Dying, 10 million years. Some regions took even longer. Full recovery of marine reef ecosystems didn't happen for 80 to 10 million years. Forest ecosystems on land took 5 to 6 million years to reach pre-extinction complexity. Why? What made this recovery so brutally slow? Because the Great Dying didn't just kill species, it broke the Earth system itself. It damaged the fundamental mechanisms that allow ecosystems to function and recover. Think of it like this. Most mass extinctions are like a forest fire. Devastating, yes. Kills most of the trees, destroys habitat, wipes out populations, but the soil remains. The nutrients are still there, often enriched by ash. Seeds survive underground. Within years, new growth appears. Within decades, you have young forest. Within centuries, you can barely tell there was a fire. The Great Dying was different. It wasn't just a forest fire. It was a forest fire that also poisoned the soil, killed the seed bank, contaminated the groundwater, and then set up conditions that caused smaller fires to keep breaking out for millions of years afterward. The early Triassic period, the 10 million years immediately following the extinction event, was characterized by what paleontologists call delayed recovery. The world didn't just snap back to normal once the Siberian Traps stopped erupting. Instead, it entered a prolonged period of environmental instability that kept ecosystems from rebuilding properly. Ocean temperatures remained elevated for millions of years, 5 to 10 degrees Celsius warmer than modern seas. Not hot enough to kill everything, but hot enough to prevent normal ecosystem function. Warm water holds less oxygen, so the ocean anoxia that had devastated marine life during the extinction event didn't fully resolve. Dead zones persisted in many ocean basins. Coastal areas that should have been teeming with life remained empty, lifeless stretches of water too toxic to support complex food webs. Carbon dioxide levels stayed high, meaning ocean acidification continued to make life difficult for any organism trying to build shells or skeletons. This wasn't a one-time catastrophe you could survive and move on from. This was a permanent environmental stress that kept preventing recovery every time ecosystems tried to rebuild. On land, things weren't much better. Forest ecosystems had been completely destroyed during the extinction event. In their place, something strange appeared. Fungal spikes. Geological layers from the early Triassic show massive increases in fungal spores and decomposer organisms. This tells us the early recovery period was dominated by decay. The world was covered in dead vegetation, and fungi were the main organisms breaking it down. Forests trying to regrow had to compete with these fungal masses. Young trees couldn't establish themselves properly. Soil communities couldn't rebuild. The whole terrestrial ecosystem was stuck in a kind of ecological limbo, not dying, but not really recovering either. Climate instability made everything worse. The early Triassic shows evidence of wild temperature swings, possibly caused by the damaged carbon cycle trying to restabilize itself. Some periods saw temperatures spike suddenly, likely from massive releases of methane from still destabilizing ocean sediments. These temperature spikes would trigger smaller extinction pulses, killing off whatever new species had managed to establish themselves. It's like trying to rebuild a house during an ongoing earthquake. You start laying foundation, another tremor hits, you have to start over, you get walls up, another shock knocks them down. Eventually you'll succeed, but it's going to take a hell of a lot longer than if the ground would just stay still. But life is stubborn. Life is patient. Life doesn't give up. Slowly, generation by generation, the survivors began to rebuild. The first ecosystems to return were simple, catastrophically simple compared to what had existed before the Great Dying. In the oceans, you had small shrimp-like creatures, tiny snails, basic worms, simple food webs with maybe 3 or 4 links, small prey eaten by slightly larger predators, no complex reef structures, no elaborate hunting strategies, no sophisticated symbiotic relationships. On land, similar patterns, small reptiles, basic insects, simple plant communities. The incredible diversity of the late Permian the forests teeming with massive amphibians and early reptiles, the complex understory vegetation and specialized pollinators, all of that was gone, replaced by ecosystems that looked more like what you'd see in harsh desert environments today. A few tough survivors eking out existence in a simplified, stressful world. But here's what's remarkable. From these simple beginnings, entirely new forms of life began to emerge. Forms that would have been impossible in the pre-extinction world because all the ecological niches were already filled by the dominant late Permian species. In the oceans, a group of reptiles called ichthyosaurs appeared. They had evolved from land-dwelling ancestors but returned to the sea, developing streamlined bodies, paddle-like limbs, and the ability to give birth to live young underwater. They looked remarkably like modern dolphins, a stunning example of convergent evolution. Within a few million years, ichthyosaurs had diversified into dozens of species, filling ecological roles that had been empty since the Great Dying wiped out the Permian marine predators. Other marine reptiles followed. Plesiosaurs with their long necks and 4 swimming flippers. Nothosaurs, crocodile-like ambush predators that hunted in coastal shallows. These weren't just replacing what had been lost. They were creating entirely new types of marine ecosystems, pioneering survival strategies that had never existed before. On land, the changes were even more dramatic. The dominant land animals of the late Permian had been synapsids, the group that would eventually give rise to mammals, but during the Permian had evolved into a spectacular array of reptile-like forms. The Great Dying hit synapsids particularly hard. Most lineages went extinct. In their place, a different group began to rise, archosaurs, the ancestors of crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. During the Permian, archosaurs had been relatively minor players, small and unimpressive compared to the dominant synapsids. After the Great Dying, with their competitors eliminated, they exploded in diversity. Within 5 million years, archosaurs had evolved into dozens of new forms. Some became large herbivores, replacing the massive dicynodonts that had dominated before. Others became swift predators, filling the roles left empty by the extinct Gorgonopsians. By 10 million years after the extinction, archosaurs completely dominated terrestrial ecosystems, and from this group would eventually emerge the most famous animals in Earth's history, dinosaurs. The first true dinosaurs appeared around 230 million years ago, about 20 million years after the Great Dying. They started small bipedal predators no bigger than dogs or cats, but they had advantages that would eventually make them rulers of the planet. More efficient respiratory systems that let them sustain activity levels impossible for other reptiles, more upright, or posture that made them faster and more agile. Possibly even the early stages of warm-bloodedness, allowing them to remain active in cooler conditions. Over the next 20 million years, dinosaurs diversified explosively. Massive, long-necked sauropods evolved to reach high vegetation. Armored ankylosaurs developed elaborate defensive adaptations. Theropods, the predatory dinosaurs, grew larger and more sophisticated, eventually producing some of the most formidable predators in Earth's history. The age of dinosaurs, which would last for 165 million years, was a direct consequence of the Great Dying. The extinction event that nearly destroyed all life also created the ecological opportunity that allowed dinosaurs to evolve and dominate. In the skies, pterosaurs were pioneering powered flight, something no vertebrate had achieved before. In the seas, the new marine reptiles were establishing complex food webs. The world was being remade, reconstructed from the ruins of the Permian extinction. But the process was agonizingly slow. Marine reef ecosystems, the complex communities of corals, sponges, algae and fish that had covered tropical shallows during the Permian, took 8 to 10 million years to truly re-establish. The corals that built these new reefs weren't even the same species as the ones that had built Permian reefs. Those were extinct. These were new forms, evolved from simple coral ancestors that had survived the extinction event. Forest ecosystems on land showed similar patterns. The first forests to return after the Great Dying were dominated by a single type of plant, Pleuramia, a small club moss relative that grew in dense stands but created very simple forest structure. No towering canopy, no complex understory, just uniform stands of similar plants. It took millions of years for true forest diversity to return, for the complex layered ecosystems with multiple tree species, diverse ground cover, and specialized pollinators and seed dispersers. The Great Dying had fundamentally changed what kind of organisms could be successful. Before the extinction, being big and dominant was often the winning strategy. After the extinction, flexibility and adaptability mattered more. The survivors and the new groups that evolved from them tended to be generalists, organisms capable of exploiting multiple food sources and surviving in variable conditions. This shift had permanent consequences. The composition of Earth's biosphere was fundamentally altered. Synapsids, which had dominated the Permian, were reduced to small, mostly nocturnal forms that would eventually evolve into mammals but wouldn't regain ecological dominance for another 185 million years. Archosaurs and their descendants became the dominant large animals on land and in the air. New types of marine organisms, particularly the marine reptiles and later the teleost fish, took over the oceans. Even the basic structure of ecosystems changed. Permian ecosystems had relatively few species, but those species were often highly abundant. Post-Great Dying ecosystems showed higher diversity but lower abundance of individual species. Food webs became more complex with more links and more redundancy built in. This might have been an evolutionary response to the extinction itself, selection favouring ecosystem structures that were more resilient to environmental shocks. The recovery also showed something else. Tipping points and cascading failures are incredibly difficult to reverse. Once the Earth system had flipped into its catastrophic state, with runaway warming, ocean anoxia and methane release, it couldn't just flip back quickly. The system had to work through the consequences, slowly rebalancing carbon cycles, reoxygenating the oceans, re-establishing normal weather patterns. This should terrify us, because we're conducting a similar experiment right now. We're dumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at rates that rival or exceed what happened during the Siberian Traps eruptions. We're warming the planet, acidifying the oceans, disrupting weather patterns. The exact same mechanisms that drove the Great Dying. The difference is we're doing it faster. The Siberian Traps erupted for 1 million years. We've been burning fossil fuels for about 200 years, and we've already changed the atmosphere more than most volcanic episodes in Earth's history. If we push Earth systems past critical tipping points, the Great Dying tells us what happens. Recovery takes millions of years, not thousands, not even hundreds of thousands. Millions. That's the timescale on which Earth systems rebalance themselves after catastrophic disruption. We won't be around to see that recovery. Neither will most of the species currently alive. The biosphere would eventually heal, would eventually rebuild, would eventually create new and possibly wonderful forms of life. But it would do so without us. The Great Dying teaches us that Earth is resilient on geological timescales, but fragile on human timescales. Push it too far, and it breaks. It will eventually fix itself, but not in time to matter to the species that broke it. That's the real lesson of the long recovery. Life survives, life adapts, life rebuilds. But the life that emerges from catastrophe is not the same as the life that went in. The world that emerged from the Great Dying was fundamentally different from the world that existed before. New dominant groups, new ecosystem structures, new evolutionary pathways. The survivors inherited a transformed planet. and so will our descendants if we're not careful. So here we are, 252 million years after the worst day in Earth's history, after the Siberian Traps erupted, after the oceans turned toxic, after 90% of all species disappeared into extinction. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, what does any of this mean for us? What can creatures living in the 21st century possibly learn from catastrophes that happened so deep in time that the numbers barely make sense? Because here's the thing, the Permian extinction shows us something that's easy to forget in our day-to-day lives. Life on Earth, all of it, every forest and ocean, every food web and ecosystem, it's all far more fragile than we think. The late Permian world wasn't weak or vulnerable. It was the product of hundreds of millions of years of evolution. Complex ecosystems filled with animals that had spent eons perfecting their survival strategies. Apex predators like gorgonopsids that had no natural enemies. Marine ecosystems so productive they supported creatures we can barely imagine today. And it almost all died. Not because life wasn't tough or adaptable or resilient, but because the interconnections that made those ecosystems so successful also made them vulnerable. When the Siberian Traps started pumping carbon dioxide and sulfur compounds into the atmosphere, they didn't just kill individual species. They broke the links that held everything together. Plants died, herbivores starved, predators followed, ocean chemistry changed, plankton collapsed, fish disappeared, everything above them in the food chain went extinct. The complexity that had taken hundreds of millions of years to build unraveled in geological instants. Now, I'm not going to stand here and lecture you about climate change or environmental responsibility. You're smart enough to draw your own conclusions. But I will say this. We're living through a period of rapid environmental change right now. Not as extreme as the Permian extinction, not even close, but faster than anything the world has seen since the dinosaurs disappeared. Species are going extinct at rates that rival major extinction events. Ocean chemistry is changing. Carbon dioxide levels are rising faster than at any point in the last 66 million years. The Permian extinction teaches us that complex systems can collapse faster than anyone expects, that tipping points exist where cascading failures become unstoppable, that once certain thresholds are crossed, recovery doesn't happen in decades or centuries, it happens in millions of years. But here's the other lesson, the one that might be even more important. Life finds a way. I know that sounds like a line from a movie, but it's also profoundly true. Even after 90% of species disappeared, even after the oceans turned toxic and the land became nearly uninhabitable, life held on. In those volcanic springs in the deep ocean vents, in those desperate refuges scattered across Pangaea, something survived. And from those tiny remnants, everything rebuilt. The Triassic brought the first dinosaurs. The Jurassic saw them dominate the planet. The Mesozoic marine revolution filled the oceans with creatures more diverse than anything the Permian had known. Eventually, after the dinosaurs fell, mammals rose, and among those mammals, eventually, impossibly, came us. Everything alive today. Every bird, every fish, every tree, every person listening. To this video, we're all descendants of those Permian survivors. All products of the greatest resilience story in Earth's history. All evidence that even when extinction seems certain, life can find a path forward. That's what deep time teaches us. Humility about our own fragility. Respect for the complexity we're part of. But also hope. Hope that even when things seem darkest, recovery is possible. Not quick, not easy, but possible. So, thank you for joining me on this journey through deep time. Thank you for spending these hours exploring the worst catastrophe in Earth's history, for learning about volcanic eruptions that lasted 1 million years, about oceans that turned toxic, about the desperate survivors who refused to give up even when the world was ending around them. If you found this video helpful for sleep, or if you just enjoyed learning about Earth's deep past, do me a favour, hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. Are you drifting off in New York or London? Falling asleep in Tokyo or Sydney? I love hearing from viewers all around the planet, all of us descendants of those ancient survivors, all connected by the story of life on Earth. And of course, subscribe if you haven't already. There are more stories from deep time to tell, more catastrophes and recoveries, more extinction events and evolutionary radiations, more reminders that we're part of something vastly larger and older than ourselves. But for now, rest well. Let your mind drift back through those millions of years, back through the recovery, back through the dying, back to a time when the world hung in the balance and somehow, impossibly, life found a way forward. Sweet dreams from deep time.